Welcome to everyone tuning in to join us for the October edition of the Samuel Lawrence Foundation's First Friday series. My name is Bart Ziegler. I'm the president of the Samuel Lawrence Foundation. Today, we're focused on a topic that means so much to everyone here at the Samuel Lawrence Foundation. Education. Education is the most precious commodity we have. And as part of our work, we fund and nurture a great number of education initiatives, both here in San Diego and around the world, because we know that the power that education has to shape future generations. For today's special edition of First Fridays, we have assembled a panel of extraordinary educators, visionary leaders from across a number of disciplines to discuss innovative advances in education. I'm thrilled to turn this over to our moderator, Lance Gould, CEO of Brooklyn Story Lab, to introduce our speakers today. Thank you, Lance.
Thank you, Bart, and welcome to all. Tomorrow is World Teachers' Day, a day to celebrate educators around the globe. We therefore thought it would be timely to take a local and global temperature on certain educational topics and issues. And so today we've invited some truly innovative leaders in the education space who will help articulate how certain approaches can be beneficial for students and what we all can learn in the process. So joining us today as panelists, we have Dr. Jelani Nelson, Chair of the Computer Science Division, Department of Electrical Engineering and Computer Science at the University of California, Berkeley. We have Mohammad Rezwan, Executive Director of the Shidulai Swanavar Sangstha, aka the Floating Schools of Bangladesh. We have Dr. Jeff Duncan Andrade, Chair of Latinx Studies and Faculty in Race and Resistance Studies, San Francisco State University. And we have Paige Morency, Director of Outreach and Communications, Basic Education Coalition. Thank you all for joining us. For our first round of discussions, we'll speak with our panelists about their specific work, and then in a second round of questions, we'll get their broader perspectives on questions about education. So first, we'll turn to Jelani. All of our guests today are accomplished educators. Jelani, among many other achievements, you are a recipient of the Presidential Early Career Award for Scientists and Engineers, which is the highest honor bestowed by the U.S. government on outstanding scientists and engineers in the early stages of their independent research careers. In addition to teaching at Berkeley, you also founded a nonprofit called Addis Coder, Inc., a free summer program in Ethiopia's capital, Addis Ababa, to introduce high schoolers to programming and algorithms. You also have a similar program in Jamaica, Jam Coders. Please tell us more about your work at Berkeley and this program that you launched in Ethiopia and Jamaica.
Yeah, sure. So at Berkeley, I started this chair role just this past summer in July, the service role to the department. But before I started the role, I did actively teach. Now I don't teach due to the new administrative duties, but typically I teach undergraduate and graduate algorithms courses. And my own research focus is on theoretical computer science, specifically algorithms, especially algorithms that use very little memory. So, one very simple problem I can tell you about that I've worked on is counting. So literally, what preschoolers do: 1, 2, 3, 4, just counting numbers. So the idea is, let's say that people, you're maintaining a counter that starts as 0, and someone says increment the counter, increment it again and again and again. So you're counting up, and then at some point they ask you, now what's the value of the counter? So, and you want to do this with very little memory. If the counter gets to be big, let's say k digits, you would naturally use k units of memory. You would remember k digits of memory to remember the current counter value. But the question we looked at was, can you do better? And people had looked at that back even in the 70s, but we gave kind of the final answer. We showed that it was known that you could basically count up to k digit numbers using only log k units of memory. But we studied it a little finer detail and tried to understand the dependence on the approximation error. So you don't get the precise counter value, but just an approximation of the counter value. And it's also a randomized algorithm that has a chance of giving an incorrect answer. So we also try to understand the dependence in the memory on this failure probability of the algorithm. So as of now, a couple of years ago, humanity now knows how to count. So that's a little bit about my research. I mean, on the Addis Coder, Jam Coder side, Addis Coder is the first one we started in Ethiopia. That started in 2011. And now it's an annual summer program. We take 100 to 150 high schoolers across the country, across Ethiopia, bring them to the capital city, provide them with room and board for a month. Everything's free. Housing is free, food's free, the program is free. And we train them 40 hours a week in algorithms and programming. Um, and yeah, that's been going on for a while. We've trained more than 700 students since the program started. It would be more, but we haven't done it every single year. There were some gaps, especially with COVID. And a lot of our students, the vast majority of our students stay in Ethiopia, go to university there. So many study computer science. Some of them have come abroad. And by abroad, I mean to us, to the US. So I think we've had like 6 students over the years go to MIT and 5 to Harvard and to Stanford, to Princeton, to Cornell, Columbia, and so forth. Several of them, I think 7 now, have started PhD programs. 2 have finished their PhDs. Some have gone on to work at Google, Meta, Apple, AMD, Amazon, and so forth. So it's definitely gotten kids interested in tech. And we started a similar program 2 years ago in Jamaica, as you mentioned, in collaboration with the University of the West Indies, Mona. And that's been an annual program since 2022. So we just ran the 3rd iteration of it this past summer.
That's amazing. Real world impact that you're having in these places, and that's really incredible. We're going to come back and visit more on these programs. First, I'm going to turn to Paige. Paige, you have 2 master's degrees in education and special education, and spent time as a teacher, consulting at the World Bank, implementing education programs around the globe, and are now overseeing the Basic Education Coalition, which is a consortium of nearly 40 implementing partners working together to strengthen U.S. government-funded international education programming in support of global stability and economic growth. Can you tell us more about the mission of BEC, the Basic Education Coalition, and tell us about the groups that comprise the organization, the progress that you've made, and the obstacles that you face as an organization?
Absolutely. Thanks, Lance. Thanks so much for having me. It's an honor. So as you started to mention, our mission at the Basic Education Coalition, or BEC for short, is to promote and expand equitable access to quality basic education so that all children and youth learn and thrive. We leverage collective technical expertise of our membership and combine advocacy efforts to raise a unified voice to ensure U.S. policymakers support and strengthen basic education for low and middle income countries. As for our membership, you can dig into each of our 38 members on our website, basiced.org, under Who We Are. We have a wide range of members, from small to large and everything in between, who implement primarily U.S.-funded education programs, at least as part of their portfolio.
And some of those organizations, just for the audience to know, include Save the Children and the International Rescue Committees, and really big organizations.
Yes, great point, Lance. We've got small, really technically focused partners like Inclusive Development Partners, for instance, and then really big ones like Chemonics International, FHI 360, both of whom I used to work for implementing projects. So kind of the big names and the small names and everything in between. So they all have a vested interest and shared interest in advocating to Congress for sustained or increased funding for the International Basic Education Account. And they also, of course, bring deep knowledge from implementing these programs that help us to connect advocacy and policy with evidence-based practices. And that's how you really do high-quality advocacy. And that's how we've had success protecting the Basic Education Account. And that's also how we've experienced a lot of progress and success in our relationship with USAID. They really see us as the go-to group of implementing partners, and they tap us very frequently for technical consultations. And this is really mutually beneficial because it ground truths USAID policies and guidance with real on-the-ground experience. And then our members are better able to implement under guidance that is more applicable and doable.
And then, and what that means for viewers in terms of USAID. So USAID really funds all of these programs around the world, and they really turn to you for anything having to do with education. Is that right?
Correct. Yeah. So backing up a bit, if anybody's not familiar with USAID, this is kind of our bread and butter. So I forget that some folks might not know what it is, but essentially we pay taxpayer dollars, and it goes to all sorts of different things, some of which is international development. And you've got all different types of sectors in international development. Education is one of them. And USAID is our primary US government donor. So all of our members essentially respond to requests for proposals from USAID, and whoever wins then implements the program in, say, Rwanda, Zimbabwe, East Timor, wherever it may be. And so a big part of what we do also is knowledge exchange. And it's a really interesting thing that we're able to do because actually all of our members are technically competitors, but we bring them together in a cooperative fashion, which is kind of a miracle that we're able to do that for the greater good of the mission of getting more children to learn around the world. And so we bring folks together, some of the most brilliant technical minds together to discuss localization and decolonizing aid, which is super important, especially nowadays. It's always been important, but it's getting a lot more focus lately, which I'll get to later. Gender and social inclusion, early childhood education, education technology, monitoring, evaluation, research, and learning, which is my background as well, and is, of course, really important to ensuring that these programs are achieving the impact and that it's a good use of taxpayer dollars. The obstacles are many. In a very divided Congress, it makes even the most straightforward legislation difficult to move. So, for example, the READ Act reauthorization, we've been working for years to get this passed, and it's a straight reauthorization of the original READ Act. And, a pretty benign bill. Everybody seems to agree that this is important, that we should continue this work. And yet here we are just trying to move it forward in Congress. Anything and everything has been difficult to move lately. So it's really important to our community, the READ Act, because it provides a certain level of protection to the important work that we're doing, helping children to access quality education around the world. And it also signals to policymakers, donors, and the like that the US government continues to value and invest in international education and sees itself as a leader in this space. So
I'm going to stop you there, Paige, because we're going to come back to you for more. But I want to get to you to Jeff and Reswam, who have some very interesting things to share as well. And just each person who's a guest today is just as all four of you are just so impressive. Jeff, you've been a classroom teacher and school leader in East Oakland for more than 25 years, and your methodologies have been widely studied and acclaimed for producing uncommon levels of social and academic success for students. You're also invited to the White House on National Teacher Appreciation Day by President Obama, and have been ranked as one of the nation's most influential scholars by Ed Week's Public Influence Rankings multiple times. Please tell us about your educational philosophy. What makes it different and what makes it so effective?
Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me today. I guess it depends on, whose philosophy you're comparing mine to. I don't feel like my approach to educating young people in my community is all that different from what the most successful educators in our community have been doing. I think a lot of times when people find an educator, particularly in a community like East Oakland, that has a lot of success, there's a lot of myth making that goes on around it, as if we have some kind of like magic pixie dust that we just blow on children and then they suddenly are incredibly engaged learners. I think what works in my classroom is what works in all successful classrooms, which is that I really care about the children in my community. I care about what's happening in their lives. I care about what's happening with their families. And in in our culture, education is a sacred act. And I think our country, particularly in the teaching of poor and working class children and children of color, treats it much more like an institutional relationship. And I think that is it gets in the way of real connection to the material, real connection to learning, and so it becomes about kind of a mechanistic relationship to learning, right? You learn the mechanics of how to read and write and do mathematics and science, but you never actually become a writer, or you never actually become a scientist, or you never actually become a mathematician, or you never actually become a coder, right? You can just go through the motions, but it's not deeply connected to your essence. And I think that kind of education is particularly disorienting and disconnecting for kids that are already feeling disconnected from power, from access, right, from justice. And so school just sort of becomes like a social mirror for them, right? And we see this, right? There's countless studies that show this, and many of the people on this call are attempting to disrupt that reality, that the young people in our communities that get the least tend to also get the least in schools, and the young people in our communities that get the most, they tend to get the most from schools. And that's not what we need from a public education system, right? A public education system should be disrupting persistent and consistent inequities and inequalities, but instead it's reproducing them. So I think I don't start philosophically from a framework that schools are failing, and then move in there to try and fix them. I actually, which I think happens a lot, right? What I think I've learned over the years, both as a student but also as an educator and a researcher, is that schools are actually doing a lot of the times what they're actually designed to do. And so that means they're not broken, right? They're executing on their design. So we don't need to fix schools. We need to rethink schools. We need to investigate what as a nation do we actually believe is the purpose of a public education system in a pluralistic multiracial democracy. And so my approach to education has been a deeply held ancestral belief that the purpose of education, the sole purpose of education, is to make young people more well, and to give them a lot more capacity and power to make choices in their lives that are aligned with their sacredness and their sacred purpose on the planet. But in order to do that, I can't start by telling them what they need to learn. I need to start with a level of curiosity about what's going on in your life, right? What really intrigues you? And then I can build a curriculum around that. And I can hit all the state and national standards. They're not particularly difficult, right? But when we start with power telling communities what it is they need to learn, there's an immediate and historical wedge that's reinforced. But when we start with curiosity about who are you, right? And who are your ancestors, and who do you come from, and what do you value, and who is your family, and who is your community, and all of those things are beautiful, and they have tremendous power and value here in this space. The relationship is completely reoriented, and that's really what it is that I do, and the programs that we've developed in our community do, that create the so-called outlier success for young people in the communities where we serve.
Well, thank you for that, and it certainly sounds like that you're hitting all the right notes, and that you're achieving the success that doesn't always come, no matter what communities you're in. So thank you for that. I definitely want to revisit a political element of this in terms of the Department of Education coming up very shortly. But first, let me just turn to Rezwan. Rezwan, you are an architect by training. And for 22 years, you have been overseeing Shitolai Swarnavar Sangstha, which is the it's more commonly known as the floating schools of Bangladesh. You run 26 floating schools on the rivers of Bangladesh. Bangladesh is a low-lying country that is prone to severe flooding, a problem that has been exacerbated even more by climate change. The solar-powered boat schools that are part of your initiative pick up the children where they live so they can go to school even if the roads are underwater, which in Bangladesh they too often are. And every village with one of these 26 boat schools also has a young women's rights association that fights for girls' rights and campaigns against child marriage. Please tell us how you came up with the idea for these floating schools and how this might be scaled across other jurisdictions.
Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to talk to you and the people globally about the floating schools. Um, I was born and grown up in one of the riverside community, and I saw the flooding, how life becomes difficult when the monsoon season comes. Bangladesh is a low-lying delta, so when the monsoon season starts, which start at the end of June and continues until October, we get a lot of rainfall and at the same time a lot of water from upstreams melting glaciers of Himalayas. And our rivers, it doesn't have that much capacity to hold all this water, so it overflows. So when as I was a child, I saw many of my friends, relatives, they couldn't go to school because all the ways to school gets got flooded. We had a transport boat, our family, that ensured my travel to the school, but the others could not go to school. Since then, I thought that I should do something for the children in our community. I studied architecture, but having a floating community was the biggest challenge at the time. And I got the inspiration from the floating gardens, floating market, vegetable market in the southern Bangladesh. It has been there for more than 400 years, the traditional floating garden. I thought if we have a floating garden on floating market on water, why don't we have floating school? That was how actually the idea of floating school came. And in our part of the world, people are more resilient because every year we got floods and cyclones. People rebuild everything from the scratch. So they know how to fight back. So I thought that if I connect these people with resources and new knowledge, then they could do wonderful things. So this is how everything started back in 2002. The first floating school was introduced at the time. Later on, we introduced libraries, training center, health clinics, even floating farming. So all on water. We I designed different types of boats, integrated renewable energy with the project. So it's a kind of project that use the traditional knowledge of boat building, and also it use local materials, local labor, and in that way the project has been sustained over all these years. Right now, this work, our floating school, has been scaled up throughout the country by other organizations. They have their own school boats operating in different rivers, and at the same time, we have similar projects. The replication actually started last during the last 10 years in India, Pakistan, Vietnam, Cambodia, Philippines, Indonesia. So all these countries now have their own school boards. And this project has strong focus not only addressing the flooding, but at the same time the increased impact of climate change as we are having that kind of waterlogged or flooding situation not only in Bangladesh but in other settings across the world. So it has that the scope possibly to scale up in all these settings.
That's amazing that that this was inspired by a 400-year-old tradition of floating gardens, that it's scaled so much already to all these other countries in Asia and Southeast Asia. And as you mentioned, with climate change looming, the negative impacts of climate change looming so ominously right now, this is something that we're probably going to need more of, not just in Bangladesh, but all over the world. Here in the U.S., we just had we're still reeling from the impacts of Hurricane Helene, which has really destroyed so much of North Carolina. And looking at floating schools and just the ingenuity of it is so impressive. Thank you, Rezwan. I'm going to come back to you in a second. But for this next round of questions, thank you all for sharing more about your individual work. For this next round of questions, I'm going to be asking all of you for your thoughts on some contemporary issues in the education space. So let's start with Paige. The 40-ish constituent organizations of the Basic Education Coalition are mostly US-based, but much of the work that BEC does is international. What have you learned from that national global juxtaposition, Paige? And what can Americans learn from other countries, from Finland to South Korea to elsewhere, that are doing things differently and often better than we are when it comes to education?
Yeah, this is a really important question. And first of all, let me just say how impressed I am with my fellow panelists. It's a really inspiring group today. So I hope to say something somewhat inspiring as well. So it's really front and center, just this question in our sector right now. USAID has made a really substantial push to focus on localization in recent years. Under previous administrations, this went by the name of the Journey to Self-Reliance, among other names over the past decades. So it's not really a new concept of having international development programs be more locally led, but it is one that's being addressed in more earnest ways in recent years, including goals of the percentage of USAID funding that goes directly to local actors, for instance. And that increases accountability for making sure that this power shift becomes a reality. So to your point, you're absolutely right. Having worked as an educator in the U.S. education system, I can tell you that it is highly imperfect and we do not have all the answers. There's so much to learn from other education systems around the world. And that's the whole concept of our coalition's technical working groups. We exchange evidence-based practices to learn from one another and also bring in experts from around the world as well. That said, just as we shouldn't be entering into countries we support, for instance, Rwanda, where I implemented an education program, with a white savior complex, thinking we know best and we have all the answers to their problems, I don't think we should be pointing to Finland either, saying their education system has the solutions for Rwanda's challenges. We can pull evidence-based practices from them, of course, and share learnings with the Rwandan government, but ultimately they know best their own context, and the sector is really learning to respect that and making the shift to empower countries to solve their own challenges with our support.
And just for clarification, when I referred to Finland and South Korea, I meant like what could we, the U.S., learn from those countries because they're generally acknowledged to be so much more advanced than we are. Not for Rwanda, but for us.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's a lot we can learn from them, especially in math and science, where we often lack in the U.S., and critical thinking skills. So to your point, the Basic Education Coalition is primarily comprised of U.S.-based organizations, but we've had some Brits join us lately, and they've offered a really interesting perspective, and we're definitely open to having more local organizations join us. But since we're advocating to the U.S. government, it's oftentimes a bit self-selecting. U.S.-based organizations are generally able to get the most out of their memberships, partaking in things like direct advocacy on the Hill with the coalition, for instance. But we're also in the midst of strategic planning right now for the next 5 years, and this is a really major question for us. So stay tuned on that front.
All right, and Jelani, I want to ask you the same question. What do you notice about in your work in Ethiopia and Jamaica about educational philosophy and values that we could utilize here?
Okay, two things. One, I'll say about Jamaica, and I'll just say something I've observed, and I don't have a good answer for why I'm observing it. I would say computer science in the U.S., you see a lot of gender disparities, more boys going into it, more boys interested in it in high school, and more young men majoring in computer science at the university level. We see the exact opposite in Jamaica. So we have an open application. Anyone can apply to, any high schooler can apply to Jam Coders. Consistently over the last 3 iterations of the program, we have about 60% of the applicants are girls. And they're very strong, and about 60% of the kids who end up, matriculating into the program are girls. So I'd love to know what Jamaica is doing to get more girls into computer science. We're not seeing it in the US, but that's one thing I've observed. One thing else, I have a few things to say about Ethiopia. We partner there with the government. So the Ethiopian Ministry of Education Addis Ababa University, which itself has many campuses. We work most closely with the Addis Ababa Institute of Technology, which is their engineering campus. Everyone really, let me put it this way, like if I were to run a program like this here in the US, or even when I run it in Jamaica, a lot of things cost money. It's provide room and board. The housing costs money, right? We have to pay for the dormitories for the students. In Ethiopia, the government looks at us like Addis Coder Inc. is doing the government a favor. They say, Jelani, you guys are coming and you're helping us accomplish our mission. Like we view it as the government's job to provide education. They give us the dorms for free. Everything's free basically. They give us the dorms for free. They give us the classrooms and the computer lab access for free. We pay the costs that are real, like we feed the students, we pay for the catering, we pay for the transportation for the teaching assistants and for the lecturers, as well as for the students to bring them to the capital. So those costs we pay, but in terms of access to like physical space and so forth, like things, sunk costs that are owned by the government, they just give it to us freely. So I don't know what the lesson is there. I mean, I just find it very nice that the government invests their resources into things like this without expecting revenue generation. Okay, so that's one. Another thing I'll say is just generally the population is very pro-education. I think that's true in Jamaica as well. I know more of the Ethiopia context because I've worked there longer, but I get the sense in the U.S. that there's a sense that all our education problems can be solved with money. I hear big numbers of amounts, money invested in various education initiatives and so forth. Ethiopia is not a rich country, and on top of that, I see people who don't come from wealthy backgrounds do quite well in the education system. So, like anecdotes, for example, one of our students in Addis Coder was the second ranked student in the national university entrance exam. So, like many countries, not the U.S. but many other countries, to get into university, there's a national exam, and based on how you do, that decides what major you can major in and what university you can go to. So a few years ago, two of the top three students in the national exam were kids who had done Addis Coder the prior year. And both of them were from low income families, relatively small towns, public schools, which, somehow it didn't fit the image you usually hear about in the US, where the people who get the educational advantage are the rich people who can afford tutors and so forth. Somehow in Ethiopia, what I've seen is even people from low income families, like the family is very pro education and really pushes their kids, like regardless of even families where, I mean, we've had kids in Addis Coder where neither parent ever did first grade. Like I remember there's a kid who comes to my mind right now. Both parents were cattle herders. The kid started first grade when he was 13 years old. So he was an older student. And, I guess somehow it doesn't fit the kinds of narratives I hear a lot in the U.S.
Such interesting data points about how about how education is viewed, and also in Jamaica about 60% of the populace being girls. It's just really fascinating.
Our program, 60% of our program, yeah.
Yeah.
It's not like we try to make that happen. That's just what naturally happens.
Rezwan, I'm not sure how much you follow American educational practices, but if you do, let us know what you think works and doesn't work in such models. And if you don't, tell us how other countries could benefit from Bangladeshi principles and approaches.
I don't have that much idea about the US education system. And in our country, we're trying to reform our education system. But I can tell you what the education should be. The purpose of education should be not help people to create money or make money. It should be make a person a better person with human qualities. If the education can, nowadays we have education that helps the students to find the right job. But if the education helps the student to become a better person, if he can or she can understand the difference between right and wrong, and the quality of selflessness, helping others. So if we can have that kind of education system, and if children or the young people get that kind of human quality from the education system, then we'll have a better place for everyone, a sustainable society for present and future.
Thank you, Rizwan. That's such an important perspective for us to remember here. That often gets so overlooked in American society. Jeff, this is something I alluded to earlier about getting into talking about the Department of Education. Education in this country is under attack in many circles, with some even calling for the elimination of the Department of Education. Share with us your thoughts, Jeff, about these developments and what kind of impact they're having on communities of color.
Well, I think one thing that is not commonly known in this country is that public education is not a constitutional right. It's a state's right, and so that creates some real complexity in what comes out of the DOE from at the Fed level versus what's actually happening on the ground in states. And I think that complexity hasn't been attended to effectively. I think what we see in the research is that when there is more local control and more autonomy, then schools tend to be or have the potential to be more responsive to the material conditions and the realities of the young people and the families that they're serving. But when you have this kind of, and it's not, I'm not arguing for like no oversight, right, or no infrastructure at all. But what I'm saying is that we haven't done a good job in this country of acknowledging that that the most effective practices tend to be community responsive practices. So there, you can have a federal DOE that's supportive of that. You can have a federal DOE that establishes some expectations and guidelines for all the nation's public school systems. But then I think what we know works best once you have that is that on the ground, people have to ground truth that for the particular needs of their community and their students. The other thing I would add is that what's different from what Jelani's talking about, even some of what Paige has mentioned, what Rezwan has talked about, is that it is also the kind of social, historical, and political context of schooling in the United States, and the role that it's played to literally designed to do harm, right? Designed to take children from their families and to deculturize them because they saw our cultures as substandard. And that history, that legacy of literally schools murdering children, right? That legacy and that history's never been directly taken on and addressed. And so the legacy of that harm and the lack of trust that's really well founded in many communities of color, that in order for us to really begin to create a community responsive public education system that does the things that we're talking about here, first there has to be some truth telling, right? There has to be a sort of truth and reconciliation conversation for the nation writ large, right? To acknowledge that we're the only industrialized country in the world to have committed 2 genocides, and the genocide against African people and the genocide against indigenous people. And yet, like, not only do we not acknowledge that, right, in any meaningful and profound way as a nation, we don't teach it in schools. And so I think there's some lessons here culturally, from a place like Germany, right? Who when post sort of Nazi regime, one of the things that Germany committed to doing was putting up public acknowledgments all over the country, saying, like, very explicitly, like, on this place, at this place, on this day, at this time, the German government murdered, right, 700, right, Jewish citizens. And and when folks have seen that and they sort of inquired, like, what, I don't know if y'all are familiar with the work of Brian Stevenson, right? But Brian Stevenson, right, told me this story when he was in Germany, learning more about how they've tried to respond to the Holocaust and the genocide committed against people in Germany, so that he could bring that learning back to the South in the United States to talk about the ways in which the genocide was committed against African people, using terrorist actions like lynching and schooling. And what the public officials that were touring around Germany said to him was, they said that the reason that, well, first he said, who pays for that? Who pays for that placard, right? And the official kind of looked at him a little sideways and was like, well, we do. The government does. And then Brian looks back at him and says, why? And then the official sort of does a double take, right? And it's like, because the only way to make sure it never happens again is to make sure nobody forgets that it happened.
That's
And
so
for
powerful.
me,
That's so powerful,
there's a
John.
lesson there, right? There's a lesson there for us as educators, that if we really want to create the pluralistic, multiracial democracy that we say we want, we've got to create a schooling system that is invested and committed to truth telling to our young people.
That's such an important point, and that's precisely what is not happening right now in Florida, where there's so much government attempt to deny a lot of historical recordings of what happened to African American people. The controversy over the Project 1619, which really shouldn't be that controversial, and yet remains so. Jelani, on a different note, California passed a controversial new math approach, a 1,000-page framework that aims to promote a focus on problem solving and applying math knowledge to real-world situations. It also encourages teachers to make math culturally relevant and accessible for all students, especially students of color who have been traditionally marginalized in this subject. You've recently been an outspoken critic of this framework. Tell us why you're opposed to this initiative and a little bit more about it from your perspective.
First of all, there were several versions of it that came out. So the first draft version came out January 2021, and it wasn't finally adopted until 2.5 years later. And that was the version that was adopted was maybe like the third version. And it did improve. But I would say the two controversial elements that concerned me were, one, in the U.S. educational system in high school, there's this traditional sequence of 9th grade algebra 1, 10th grade geometry, 11th grade algebra 2, and then maybe after that you can go different ways, statistics or pre-calculus, calculus, and so forth. So one of the controversial topics was about acceleration. So I, for example, took algebra 1 not in 9th grade, but in 8th grade. And some people take it even earlier, 7th grade, 6th grade. Depends on your school district and what they allow. And if you accelerate, what it allows you to do is take more advanced courses while you're still in high school. For example, if you want, the most natural way to reach calculus in 12th grade is to take algebra 1 in 8th grade, not in 9th grade. So I think the proponents of the framework at that time, if I had to summarize their viewpoint, it's like, let's look at who's accelerating, who's actually taking algebra 1 in 8th grade. We see a lot more Asian and white kids doing it than we see Black and Latino kids. And they say, this ability to accelerate in your math education is a source of racial inequity and thus must be eliminated. So they were pushing to not have any math acceleration across the state of California. Every kid should have to wait till 9th grade to take algebra 1. So that was one of the things that was in the first version of the framework, which met a lot of opposition, including from me. And interestingly, I think, my reason for opposition is also equity grounded. It's, look at San Francisco. San Francisco just brought back algebra in 8th grade this semester, this academic year. But for 10 years, starting in 2014 till now, they banned it. No public schools in San Francisco are allowed to have algebra 1 in 8th grade. because then they for the reasons that I gave you. Um, and so what was the situation in San Francisco? 30% of kids in San Francisco were in private school. Okay. And private schools can do whatever they want. So now what have you done? You've set up a system where the wealthy can access this acceleration and those who can't afford private school can't access it. So that's an equity issue created by eliminating this ability to accelerate. And just to drive the point home even further, one of the main authors of the framework put her two kids, she had two daughters, put them in a fancy private school in the South Bay, almost $50,000 per year tuition. You go to that private school's website, and what do they say? We teach all our kids algebra 1 in 8th grade. Right? So it's like, even the people who were pushing this framework were proving our point that, there's an equity issue here to banning the acceleration. So now what's happening in other states, there are several other states now that are doing they were trying to do acceleration in a more fair way, where it's like opt out. So if a kid does well enough early on, they got automatically placed in algebra 1 in 8th grade. It's not up to pushy parents or parents who are in the know who are making sure that their kids do it. It's the state is making sure that the kids have that access, and they're in it unless someone actively, like the parents actively try to pull them out. So I think that's gaining more traction. So that's one. That's only one. The second point of controversy was related to this traditional pathway I told you, algebra 1, geometry, algebra 2. And there are some who are saying algebra 2 is an outdated course. It's a relic from the Sputnik era. We've been teaching it since the 19th century. Why don't we teach the modern math that kids need to succeed in today's world? Okay. And they said, instead of algebra 2, let's, for example, teach kids data science. Okay. And there's nothing in principle wrong with a high school data science course, but the problem is that the two most popular courses called high school data science that exist, first of all, one of them was created by that same author of the California Math Framework who put her kids in a private school that teaches algebra 1 in 8th grade. Turns out she also made a high school data science class. Okay. She has no data science qualifications, no data science background. She has no business making such a curriculum. And in the initial draft of the framework, she even was advertising that curriculum in the framework itself. And guess what? Her organization was charging school districts money to train their teachers to teach that, how to teach that curriculum. So there was a huge conflict of interest there. And when people who actually know data science looked at the curriculum, there was massive pushback. So, for example, 235 professors across the UC system signed an open letter saying this should not happen. These courses, like that particular course, for example, should not be a substitute for algebra 2, signed by deans of data science. Okay, the head of data science at my own university, Berkeley, the head of data science at Stanford, at UC San Diego, various data science faculty, math and computer science faculty. The people who actually know the subject matter said, no, this is an inappropriate substitution. Also, I think a couple hundred, maybe almost 200 faculty in the Cal State system, some community college faculty, and so forth. So the people, and if you go to mathmatters.ai, check that out, mathmatters.ai, that was a pushback letter signed by industry people in AI and data science, people like Sam Altman, leadership from OpenAI, from Databricks, which is a data science company, from Google, from Facebook, from Apple, from NVIDIA, and so forth. So kind of everyone who knew the material, the mathematics material, was saying, no, this is all nonsense.
Well, thank you, John. Like that's really you've really elucidated what is happening there. Does anyone else have any opinion on this particular matter? And if not, I'm going to move on to Rezwan. Rezwan, on another note, Bangladesh is just emerging from a very troubling period under the 15-year rule of Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina, an autocratic leader who was just overthrown this summer, largely by a college student-led protest movement. Now Bangladesh has installed Nobel Peace Prize laureate Muhammad Yunus as head of state. How would you assess the current state of the country, Rezwan, and what does it mean to you to see students leading a democracy movement?
The current situation of the country is very challenging and indeed complex. The leadership we have right now, they should be honest to themselves and to the people, and they should focus on time-bound solutions. They should consider doing things in different phases, and they should consider involving more people in the decision making process, particularly the politicians. And the student movement we had in July and August this year, it has created a huge expectations. People expect a lot of things from them, from the present leadership, particularly from Professor Mohammed Yunus, because he has been successful in doing many things throughout his career. So still people believe that he can do wonderful things for the country, solving many challenges, reforming all the systems we have. And there are some concerns we have, because the people we have running the country, they are not politicians. And it is it is not easy for them to understand and address all the challenges. And right now, the system is not functioning. If you look at the police, they're not on the street, so they're not doing anything. So it will find in many other organs of the country. So it is very challenging for them to address, reform all the things within a short period of time.
Thank you for that report and for that update. And of course, we're sending well wishes to you and all your countrymen there to navigate this difficult situation. And it seems like at least is on the other side of what was even a much worse situation. Seems to be on the rise in a good way. Um, Turning to Paige, the Basic Education Coalition has been a champion of a movement called Universal Design for Learning. Tell us more about this movement and why you think this could be a real game changer for a more equitable education system.
Sure. Thanks, Lance. Beck had the opportunity to work with Lance and Brooklyn Story Labs on a Universal Design for Learning video in recent years and had such a great experience bringing this approach to life together. We'll be sharing a link to the video at the end of our session today so you can check it out for yourselves. But UDL, Universal Design for Learning, is basically like a buffet for learners. Not only does a buffet offer a variety of options for diners who want to sample numerous dishes, but it also caters to diners with allergies, intolerances, or diets without negatively impacting others. At a buffet, diners choose what's best for them, and arguably, buffets offer a fuller dining experience for all without diminishing the overall experience for the majority. So UDL brings the buffet experience to the classroom, giving every student agency through choice to create the learning experience that best suits them. The idea for UDL came originally from the Universal Design, which is a civic design approach that aims to make buildings, products, and environments more accessible. So if you think of a ramp, for instance, on the one hand, that simple improvement makes the building accessible for those who can't climb stairs. At the same time, the ramp does not reduce accessibility for others, and everyone has options to get into the building as they like. So it's good for everyone. Similarly, closed captions can make a film more accessible for those with hearing impairments, but the captions can also improve comprehension and the viewing experience for all. I don't know about you, but I always have closed captions on. There's a great design.
In the classroom page, like you're taking this concept of universal design for learning. In a civic scenario, it would be a ramp. In a movie going experience, even those people who don't have hearing impaired, even those people who are not hearing impaired, can still follow along, and so it doesn't hold back. How does it work in a classroom? Give us an example of how it would work in a classroom.
Yeah. So I think people get a little bit intimidated by, there's always a new approach, but this really doesn't need to be overly complicated. It can be quite simple and can be implemented in really low resource environments. And it cannot be more difficult for the teacher. In fact, it can help the teacher to have more engaged learners. So really low hanging fruit, for instance, really easy interventions in UDL would be seating a student who can't see very well closer to the blackboard. Or for some learners challenged by reading comprehension and writing during a certain lesson, offering them the option to give an oral version of the exam. Some need tactile learning, so using natural resources or materials to learn. And then the easiest one is just wait time, giving children the opportunity to think of their answer before calling on the first student with their hand raised, which was always me, So again, while UDL began 30 years ago with a focus on students with disabilities, educators very quickly realized that all learners benefit from it. And so essentially, I'm not saying that this is the be all end all. This is the only strategy, the only approach. But what doesn't work is the middle of the road approach that is just, a teacher standing at the blackboard reciting information at the student. And I think we can probably all agree on that. So it's really exciting to see such dedication to such an inclusive framework. USAID, for instance, is requiring that this approach be included in all new education programs going forward.
Jeff, have you utilized or are you familiar with UDL? Do you have any opinion on it? Has it been helpful for you in your classrooms?
Well, it's a long established practice under a new acronym, and apparently acronyms are mandatory in education. Otherwise, it's not real. What we're talking about here is effectively differentiated instruction, right? Which all successful educators have done for. I mean, there's like 4 decades of research on that, and that's pretty rare in the research community to have like that. 4 decades of research that largely agree on what are the practices that are the most effective for kids, particularly the most vulnerable and the most wounded kids. But what I like about UDL is that it starts naming much more explicitly the kind of inequities that schools have upheld or just sort of like turned a passive blind eye to. What worries me about UDL is that and this isn't necessarily a fault of UDL, but I think it's people like glob onto this idea that there must be some easy solution that we can just adopt, and then everybody will do it, and then kids will be doing so much better, and it fails to pay attention to the fact that really the it's the knowing doing gap that we have to close in our field, right? That we know what works for children. Absolutely, we know, right? But what we don't do is we don't actually invest in teacher recruitment, right? So we're not paying attention to who's actually going into the profession, and how do we make sure that the profession actually reflects the children that are there. 86% of the national teaching force is white. 84% of the national teaching force is female. Right. And so, and I'm not saying that white women can't be effective teachers of anybody, but I'm saying that is so wildly skewed versus who the children, the families that are actually have butts and seats and are being served. Right. That has to be addressed. We don't train teachers well pre-service. Like our model is archaic, and it does. Teachers say this all the time. Like the stuff that I learned in my teacher ed program, I can't even use it in the school, right? So basically, all I did was just pay to get this certificate that would then allow me to be retrained by the school or the district that hires me. And then thirdly, the other kind of strand of this web is that we don't train and support teachers well once they're in practice. And so we're hemorrhaging teachers. Teachers are leaving the career early. They're leaving it often because they're like, I'm not even getting the support I need to be successful here. So for me, okay, cool. We have another framework. maybe that's, but is that really what we're saying we need? I think we have a national crisis around how we actually train, support, and recruit and develop the people that have to then implement the new framework. So I'm not against a new framework, but I'd like to see us as a nation have much more honest conversations about why our public school system, year over year, decade over decade, continues to fail the exact same group of children and families.
Thank you for that viewpoint. It's really important to have that discussion. I think we were going to take some questions from the audience, but I think we're running a little over time. So I'm going to just skip to this last part of the program here. As we come to the close of our program, I want to give each guest an opportunity to give a closing thought. So please share with us one thing that in this very contentious time gives you hope for the future vis-a-vis education. So let me start with Rezwan. Just on my screen, he's top first there.
Thank you. I think we should consider work with each other, people, government, educators, entrepreneurs. So we need to share our ideas, develop on solutions so that we can ensure quality education for everyone in every situation. And it would be wonderful if we work all together throughout the world, and then we will be able to solve many of our challenges. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rezwan. And I'm going to go next to see. I think that would be Jeff, going clockwise.
I think what makes me hopeful, and I am an eminently hopeful dude, that is being around young people and educators. There's a vibrancy in when you walk into a classroom that is truly responsive. It's magical. It's magical to watch when young people are exposed to really committed, caring teaching. And I am very intentional about getting time in those spaces and being a participant in those kinds of spaces, because if I mean, seeing is believing, right? Like if we've seen it, if we've experienced it, we know it's possible in more and more places, and that makes me hopeful.
Thank you so much, Jeff. And Paige, let's go to you.
Sure. I think just knowing, as we all do on this call, that education is a force multiplier and that these children are really our future, and all the potential that comes with that. Education not only helps to set the children around the world up for a brighter future, but it helps them to contribute to economies, to stability, to curbing migration. And I think that's something that we can all agree on in a bipartisan way, which is kind of a miracle in this day and age. So I did just want to make a little plug, though, that of course, in order to continue helping students around the world to gain access to quality education, we need continued funding. And whether under a Democratic or a Republican administration in past years, it is always a fight, always a struggle. And we really have to lean on our champions in the House to make sure that we receive sustained or increased funding for international basic education. And so that's why the work that we do as a coalition is so important. But maybe there is we had great hopes for this administration with Jill Biden as an educator, and depending on how things go, maybe we have a vice president who is an educator as well, and hopefully it pans out to more dollars this time. We had a lot of really good lip service to education during this administration, but hopefully the funding can follow in years to come. So holding out hope.
And Jelani, giving you the last word here.
Sure. So reasons for optimism. Okay, so I'll say when I was growing up, I thought I would be interested in computer science, but I was from a very small place. I'm from St. Thomas, U.S. Virgin Islands. Our entire island had only one bookstore, and that bookstore didn't sell any computer science books. So I remember having to wait until our family went on vacation to the mainland USA. I went to like a Borders or Barnes and Nobles, bought a book on C and C++, and then flew it back home and tried to teach myself in 12th grade. Then we had the internet, and I think the internet did a lot. I mean, the internet was there in high school too, but of course it became more abundant and more resources became available online, and it kind of democratized education. And then we had MOOCs, the massively online open courses, edX and Coursera and so forth. And then now we also have AI tools. So I guess I'm optimistic because I just see more access, more free access, easy access, and the democratization of knowledge. So that makes me very, very optimistic.
Wow, what a powerful personal story too. Thank you for sharing that, Jelani. And thank you all for this wonderful conversation, for sharing your perspectives here today. You are all doing such inspiring work, really, and I hope the audience will follow up and check out your work. And to do so, for the audience here, please, after watching this, rewatch the podcast next week and see a transcript at Samuel Lawrence Foundation at the website in the coming days. The website is samuellawrencefoundation.org. We'll have more information about all four of our panelists and their projects and links to videos and things of that nature. And thank you so much to our four panelists. Please learn more about their work on the Samuel Lawrence Foundation website. And thank you to Blue Planet Alliance for their partnership in First Fridays. Please also visit brooklynstorylab.net. That's my company, to learn more about the purpose-driven work that we are doing globally. And lastly, come back next month in November. We'll have another episode of First Fridays and explore other contemporary issues in the environment, creative, and social justice space. Thank you so much, everybody, and goodbye.